The Mediterranean dawn of July 10th, 1943. Shattered. With the roar of over 3,000 Allied vessels cutting through choppy waters toward the shores of Sicily. Lieutenant Colonel James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne Division pressed his face against the transport aircraft's small window, watching tracers streak across the pre-dawn sky like deadly fireflies. Below, the largest amphibious invasion in history was about to unfold. "This is it, boys," Gavin called to his paratroopers over the engine noise. "Sicily today, Rome tomorrow, Berlin next year." The men's faces, blackened with combat paint, reflected a mixture of determination and terror that would become legendary in the annals of warfare. Operation Husky, as the invasion was codenamed, represented 18 months of meticulous planning by Allied commanders. General Dwight David Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had staked his reputation on this bold gambit to knock Italy out of the war and open a second front in Europe. The stakes could not be higher. Failure here would delay the liberation of Europe by at least a year and potentially alter the course of the entire war. The Axis defenders were no pushovers. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had transformed Sicily into a fortress. With German and Italian forces numbering over 200,000 men, the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, battle-hardened veterans from the Russian front, waited in the island's interior. Italian coastal divisions manned concrete bunkers along the beaches, their artillery zeroed in on likely landing zones. As the first wave of landing craft approached the beaches near Gela, Syracuse, and the Pacino Peninsula, Sergeant Mike Russo of the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red 1, checked his Thompson submachine gun one final time. The veteran of North Africa campaigns knew that the next few hours would determine whether the Allies could gain their desperately needed foothold in Fortress Europe. The initial bombardment began at 4:30 in the morning, with naval guns from battleships like the USS Texas and HMS Warspite pounding Axis positions. Shell bursts illuminated the coastline in brilliant flashes, revealing the medieval towns and ancient fortifications that would soon become battlegrounds. According to historical accounts from the National Archives, the pre-invasion intelligence had identified over 60,000 German troops on the island. Significantly more than initially estimated, this intelligence would prove crucial as Allied forces prepared to face determined resistance. At precisely 5:45, the first landing craft ground onto the beaches. Major General Terry Allen's 1st Infantry Division stormed ashore at Gela, while General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army attacked near Syracuse. The sounds of warfare, rifle fire, explosions, and shouted commands replaced the Mediterranean's peaceful morning calm. The German response was swift and brutal. Major General Paul Conrath's Hermann Göring Division launched immediate counterattacks, sending Mark IV panzers rumbling toward the beaches. Italian Bersaglieri troops, their distinctive plumed hats, making them unmistakable, fought with unexpected tenacity despite their army's reputation for poor performance. As the sun climbed higher over Sicily's ancient landscape, it became clear that this would be no easy victory. The Allies had gained their foothold, but the real battle for Sicily was just beginning. The fate of the Mediterranean theater and, perhaps the war itself, hung in the balance as American, British and Canadian forces prepared to drive inland against determined Axis resistance. The second day of Operation Husky dawned with the acrid smell of cordite and burning fuel hanging over the Sicilian beaches like a funeral shroud. Captain John Lucas of the 3rd Infantry Division crouched behind a destroyed Italian pillbox, his uniform already soaked with sweat and grime. The thermometer had climbed past 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was barely 8 in the morning. "Jerry's bringing up his panzers," shouted Sergeant First Class Anthony Kowalski, pointing toward the dust clouds rising from the hills above Gela. The distinctive rumble of tracked vehicles grew louder as the Hermann Göring Division prepared to push the Americans back into the sea. This was the moment General Patton had warned them about. The critical first 48 hours, when the invasion could succeed or fail catastrophically. The German counterattack struck with methodical precision. Panzer Mark IVs and Tiger tanks, their long-barreled guns traversing methodically, advanced through olive groves that had stood peacefully for centuries. Behind them came grenadiers of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, their camouflaged uniforms making them nearly invisible among the Mediterranean vegetation. Lieutenant General George Smith Patton Jr. had arrived on the beach at Gela just after midnight. personally directing traffic and ammunition supplies with his characteristic flair. His ivory-handled pistols gleamed in the morning sun as he stood atop a sand dune, seemingly oblivious to the German artillery falling around his position. "We didn't come this far to get pushed back into the drink by some Nazi tank drivers," Patton declared to his staff officers. His words carried across the beach, inspiring exhausted soldiers who had been fighting continuously since the landing. The general's presence had an almost mystical effect on American morale, wherever Patton appeared. Resistance stiffened, and attacks gained momentum. The first major tank battle occurred near the Gela airfield, where Captain James Brennan's Sherman tanks of the 2nd Armored Division encountered German panzers in a point-blank engagement. The clash lasted 3 hours, with burning vehicles scattered across wheat fields that would never again know peace. Brennan's tank took 2 direct hits but continued fighting, his crew working with mechanical precision, despite the chaos around them. British forces under General Montgomery faced their own challenges near Syracuse, ancient city, founded by Greek colonists over a millennia earlier, became a maze of street fighting as Italian Barcellari and German paratroopers contested every building. Captain Nigel Thornton of the Durham Light Infantry found himself fighting house to house through neighborhoods where Archimedes once walked. The Axis defense was complicated by political tensions between German and Italian commanders. Field Marshal Kesselring had positioned his most reliable units, German divisions, in the island's interior, while Italian coastal divisions bore the initial assault. This arrangement reflected Berlin's growing distrust of Italian military capabilities, suspicion that would prove both justified and costly. As reported in wartime dispatches from correspondent Ernie Pyle, the fighting in Sicily's hill towns possessed a medieval character that seemed to mock modern warfare's technological sophistication. Ancient stone walls that had withstood centuries of Mediterranean storms now absorbed machine gun bullets and artillery shells. By July 12th, Allied forces had established a precarious beachhead extending roughly 30 miles inland. However, German resistance was stiffening rather than weakening. The Wehrmacht's tactical doctrine emphasized immediate counterattack. Kesselring was implementing it with characteristic German thoroughness. The cost was mounting on both sides. American casualty reports listed over 800 killed and wounded in the first 2 days, while German losses were estimated at similar numbers. Italian units were surrendering in increasing numbers. But German formations continued fighting with professional competence that Allied intelligence had perhaps underestimated. The Battle of Sicily was developing into exactly what Eisenhower had hoped to avoid: a prolonged, costly campaign that would drain resources needed for the eventual invasion of France. Yet there was no turning back now. The die had been cast on those July beaches, and the outcome would determine the pace of Allied victory in Europe. The scorching heat of mid-July 1943 turned Sicily's interior into a furnace that tested both armies to their limits. Major Robert Murphy of the 45th Infantry Division led his company through terraced hillsides where gnarled olive trees provided the only shade. The ancient landscape, carved by countless generations of Sicilian farmers, now bore the scars of modern warfare: shell craters, abandoned equipment, and hastily dug foxholes. General Montgomery's British 8th Army had captured Syracuse and was pushing northward along the eastern coast. But their advance had slowed against German defensive positions in the Etna foothills. The volcanic slopes, honeycombed with caves and natural fortifications, offered perfect defensive terrain for Field Marshal Kesselring's troops. "The Krauts know how to pick their ground," observed Colonel William Darby, commander of Darby's Rangers, as his men prepared to assault the hilltop town of Butera. The German defenders had withdrawn to successive ridge lines, each one carefully prepared with interlocking fields of fire. Every advance cost blood, and every hilltop revealed another hill beyond it. General Patton's 7th Army faced different challenges as they drove toward Palermo, Sicily's ancient capital. The Sicilian interior was a maze of dusty roads, deep ravines, and fortified hill towns that had controlled trade routes since Roman times. Each settlement required careful reconnaissance and often costly assault to secure. The German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, under General Eberhard Roth, conducted a masterful fighting withdrawal that frustrated Allied commanders. Unlike their Italian allies, who increasingly showed signs of war weariness, German units maintained discipline and tactical coherence even under intense pressure. Italian resistance was crumbling in other sectors. The Livorno Division, defending the approaches to Agrigento, began surrendering in battalion-sized units. Sicilian civilians, long subjected to fascist control, increasingly viewed the Allies as liberators rather than invaders. White bedsheets appeared in windows, the universal symbol of surrender and welcome. Captain Angela Martinez, one of the few female war correspondents covering the Sicilian campaign, reported witnessing extraordinary scenes of Italian soldiers simply walking away from their positions. They remove their helmets, leave their rifles propped against stone walls, and head home to their villages, she wrote in dispatches that captured the collapse of Italian military morale. The heat became a third enemy for both sides. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and water supplies were often contaminated or simply unavailable. Medical units reported increasing cases of heat exhaustion and dehydration. Soldiers learned to move during the cooler hours of dawn and dusk, sheltering in whatever shade they could find during the blazing afternoons. Allied air superiority was beginning to tell. The Northwest African Air Forces, under General Karl Spaatz, had achieved complete control of Sicilian skies. German and Italian aircraft rarely appeared, leaving Axis ground forces vulnerable to constant harassment by Allied fighter bombers. The Messerschmitt fighters that had once dominated Mediterranean skies were now grounded by fuel shortages and overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. Supply problems plagued both armies. The Allies struggled to move equipment and ammunition inland from their beach depots over Sicily's primitive road network. German forces faced even worse difficulties as Allied air attacks interdicted supply convoys from the Italian mainland. The ferry routes across the Strait of Messina, Sicily's lifeline to continental Europe, came under increasing pressure. The ancient city of Enna, perched on a mountaintop in Sicily's center, became a key objective for both armies. Its commanding position overlooked roads leading to all parts of the island, making it a natural strongpoint. The approaching battle for this historic fortress would test both armies' resolve and tactical skill. As July's third week began, Allied forces controlled roughly half of Sicily, but German resistance showed no signs of breaking. The Wehrmacht's fighting withdrawal was consuming precious time that Eisenhower needed for future operations. The Battle of Sicily was proving that even a successful invasion was only the beginning of a long and costly campaign. The stage was set for the climactic phase of Operation Husky, as both armies prepared for battles that would determine not just Sicily's fate, but the timing of the entire Allied advance toward the German homeland. The ancient port city of Messina, perched on Sicily's northeastern tip like a crown jewel, became the ultimate prize as July 1943 drew to its close. Lieutenant Colonel John Church of the 90th Infantry Division studied the city through his binoculars, knowing that whoever controlled Messina controlled the narrow strait separating Sicily from mainland Italy. Field Marshal Kesselring had made his intentions clear. German forces would conduct a fighting withdrawal to prepared positions around Mount Etna, using Sicily's mountainous terrain to delay the Allies as long as possible. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division, now reinforced with the 1st Parachute Division, had transformed the volcanic slopes into a formidable defensive zone. General Patton's 7th Army had captured Palermo on July 22nd after a brilliant flanking movement that caught German defenders off guard. The ancient Sicilian capital, with its Norman cathedrals and Arab-influenced architecture, fell almost without a fight as Italian units surrendered en masse. But Palermo was a sideshow. The real prize lay 150 miles to the east. "Montgomery's moving like an old woman," Patton complained to his staff officers, his frustration evident in every gesture. The British 8th Army's methodical advance along the coastal road toward Catania had bogged down against determined German resistance. Every bridge demolished, every hillside fortress cost precious time that allowed more Axis troops to escape across the strait. The rivalry between Allied commanders was becoming as intense as the battle against German forces. Montgomery's reputation for careful preparation clashed with Patton's preference for rapid, aggressive action. Both generals wanted the honor of capturing Messina, and their competition was affecting operational coordination. Captain Francesco Lombardi of the Italian Alpine Division found himself in an impossible position. His men were demoralized and hungry, their uniforms in tatters after weeks of retreat. The fascist government's authority was crumbling, and rumors of political upheaval in Rome spread through Italian ranks like wildfire. On July 25th, news arrived that stunned both armies. Benito Mussolini had been arrested by order of King Victor Emmanuel. The political earthquake in Rome created chaos in Axis ranks. Italian units began surrendering wholesale, their officers uncertain whether Italy remained Germany's ally or had switched sides. German commanders, already suspicious of Italian reliability, began planning for the worst-case scenario, defending Sicily and southern Italy without Italian support. Colonel Kurt Student's 1st Parachute Division exemplified German determination to continue fighting regardless of Italian politics. These elite troops, veterans of Crete and the Russian front, established defensive positions in the Etna Massif that would require enormous Allied casualties to overcome. Every cave and lava tube became a fortress, every ridge a killing ground, as documented in military archives from the Imperial War Museum. The fighting around Mount Etna represented some of the most challenging terrain warfare in the European theater. The volcanic landscape, sculpted by millennia of eruptions, provided natural defensive positions that modern military engineering could hardly improve. The German evacuation plan, codenamed Operation Lehrgang, was already in motion. Kesselring had positioned ferries and barges at multiple points along the Messina Strait, ready to transport men and equipment to the Italian mainland under cover of darkness. Allied air attacks hindered, but could not completely stop these nighttime evacuation runs. American forces were learning hard lessons about Mediterranean warfare. The combination of mountainous terrain, extreme heat, and determined resistance created challenges unlike anything encountered in North Africa. Infantry units averaged only 2 or 3 miles of advance per day, and each mile cost casualties that could not easily be replaced. The race to Messina intensified as August began. Patton ordered his forces to advance along 3 separate routes, hoping to outflank German positions and reach the city before Montgomery's forces. The 45th Infantry Division pushed along the northern coast road, while the 1st Infantry Division attacked through the interior mountains. German rearguard actions grew increasingly desperate. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division conducted a series of delaying actions that cost the Allies precious time and casualties. Each demolished bridge, each defended hill town, allowed more German troops to reach the evacuation beaches. The outcome of the Battle of Sicily was no longer in doubt. A victory was certain. But the manner of that victory, and particularly the speed with which it was achieved, would determine how many Axis troops escaped to fight another day on the Italian mainland. The morning mist of August 10th, 1943, clung to Mount Etna's volcanic slopes like a ghostly shroud, as Allied forces prepared for what everyone knew would be the final phase of the Sicilian campaign. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, stood with the 1st Infantry Division's advance elements, watching German positions through the pre-dawn darkness. "They're getting ready to run," observed Major General Lucien Truscott, commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, as he studied intelligence reports indicating massive German troop movements toward Messina. The Wehrmacht's evacuation across the strait was accelerating. With ferries and barges operating around the clock despite Allied air attacks, the political situation had grown increasingly complex following Mussolini's arrest. Marshal Pietro Badoglio's new Italian government was secretly negotiating with the Allies while publicly maintaining the Axis alliance. Italian units were surrendering so rapidly that prisoner of war camps overflowed with demoralized soldiers who simply wanted to go home. General Montgomery's forces finally broke through the Catania defenses on August 5th. But the victory came too late to prevent significant German withdrawals. The British Eighth Army's methodical approach, while militarily sound, had given Kesselring precious time to organize his evacuation. Thousands of German troops who might have been captured were now safely across the strait. The German 1st Parachute Division conducted a masterful rearguard action in the Etna foothills, using the volcanic terrain's natural defensive advantages to maximum effect. Colonel Richard Heydrich's paratroopers, elite soldiers trained for the most difficult assignments, made the Allies pay for every ridge and ravine. Captain Maria Rossi, an Italian nurse working with the Alpine Division, witnessed the heartbreaking dissolution of her country's army. "The soldiers were not cowards," she later wrote in her memoirs. "They were simply finished with a war that had brought nothing but suffering to Italy." When they saw Allied soldiers, many wept with relief. The weather added another dimension to the campaign's final phase. Sicily's August heat was brutal, with temperatures reaching 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the inland valleys. Both armies moved primarily during cooler hours, seeking shade during the blazing afternoons when metal equipment became too hot to touch. Allied air superiority was now complete. The Northwest African Air Forces flew over 2,000 sorties daily, attacking German positions and interdicting evacuation routes. However, the Luftwaffe's absence also meant that Kesselring's forces could move with relative impunity during nighttime hours. When Allied aircraft were grounded, supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean had become crucial to Allied success. Liberty ships and converted passenger liners brought ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements to Sicilian ports that were being rapidly expanded by Allied engineers. The logistical achievement of maintaining 300,000 troops in combat was nearly as impressive as their battlefield performance. As reported in contemporary accounts by war correspondent Ernie Pyle, the fighting in Sicily's hill towns possessed a timeless quality that transcended modern warfare's technological aspects. You could imagine Roman legions fighting over the same ground 2,000 years ago, Pyle wrote. The landscape doesn't change, only the weapons. The German evacuation accelerated dramatically as August progressed. Operation Lehrgang was extracting entire divisions across the Messina Strait under cover of darkness, despite constant Allied air attacks. Kesselring's engineers had prepared ferry terminals and loading facilities with typical German thoroughness. American forces advancing along the northern coast road encountered increasingly desperate German resistance. The 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, covering the evacuation, fought fierce delaying actions at every defensible position. Each demolished bridge, each defended crossroads, bought precious hours for the evacuation fleet. The ancient city of Taormina, with its Greek amphitheater overlooking the Ionian Sea, became a symbol of the campaign's approaching end. When American troops entered the city on August 15th, they found it abandoned, except for a few Italian civilians who emerged from hiding with white flags. By mid-August, it was clear that the Battle of Sicily was entering its final hours. German resistance was crumbling as evacuation priorities took precedence over defensive operations. The race to Messina had become more symbolic than tactical, but Allied commanders understood that symbols matter in war as much as strategic objectives. The pre-dawn darkness of August 17, 1943, was shattered by the thunder of American artillery, as the 3rd Infantry Division launched its final assault toward Messina. Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Bernard led the advance reconnaissance, his jeep bouncing over roads cratered by weeks of warfare. Behind him, columns of Sherman tanks and half-tracks stretched back through the Sicilian hills like a mechanical river flowing toward victory. Field Marshal Kesselring's evacuation was reaching its climax. The German 14th Panzer Corps under General Hans Hube had conducted one of the most successful strategic withdrawals in military history. Over 60,000 German troops and 10,000 vehicles had already crossed the Messina Strait. Despite constant Allied air attacks and naval bombardment, General Patton's forces were now within artillery range of Messina. But the prize they sought was rapidly becoming an empty shell. German demolition teams systematically destroyed port facilities, ammunition dumps, and anything else of military value. The ancient city, founded by Greek colonists in the 8th century before Christ, was being methodically stripped of its strategic importance. They're thorough, I'll give them that, admitted Colonel James Gavin, as his paratroopers advanced through abandoned German positions. Empty ammunition boxes, discarded equipment, and hastily constructed fortifications testified to the Wehrmacht's professional competence even in defeat. The German withdrawal was a tactical masterpiece, even if the strategic situation was hopeless. British forces under General Montgomery were simultaneously approaching Messina from the south, setting up the final act in the Allied commanders' rivalry. Both armies pushed forward with renewed urgency. Knowing that capturing the city first would provide bragging rights that would last for generations, the Italian collapse was now complete. Marshal Badoglio's government was secretly negotiating an armistice with the Allies. Though the announcement would not come for several more weeks, Italian soldiers abandoned their positions en masse, many simply removing their uniforms and blending into the civilian population. The myth of fascist military prowess had been permanently shattered on Sicily's ancient battlefields. Captain Hans Müller of the Hermann Göring Division commanded one of the last German rearguards defending the approaches to Messina. His Panzer Mark IV had survived 3 months of Mediterranean combat, its steel hull scarred by near misses and ricochet marks. Now, with evacuation imminent, Müller faced the bitter task of covering his comrades. Retreat, while knowing he might not survive to cross the strait himself. The final German ferries operated under incredibly dangerous conditions. Allied aircraft attacked continuously during daylight hours, forcing the evacuation to occur primarily at night. Searchlights from Allied warships swept the dark waters, and naval artillery fell among the crowded vessels with devastating effect. Yet the evacuation continued with Germanic determination. Sicilian civilians emerged from hiding as German forces withdrew. Many had suffered under both fascist oppression and wartime privation, and they welcomed the Allies as liberators. However, the island's economy was shattered, infrastructure destroyed, and recovery would require years of patient reconstruction. According to military historians from the United States Army Center of Military History, the Sicilian campaign cost the Allies approximately 23,000 casualties, while Axis losses exceeded 160,000, mostly Italian prisoners. However, the German evacuation meant that experienced Wehrmacht units would soon be defending the Italian mainland. The race to Messina climaxed on the morning of August 17th. American reconnaissance units of the 3rd Infantry Division entered the city at 6:10 in the morning, closely followed by elements of the British 8th Army. The ancient port was almost completely deserted, its strategic value already evacuated across the narrow strait. General Patton arrived in Messina just hours after his troops, characteristically dramatic in his moment of triumph. The general posed for photographers beside ancient Roman ruins, while Allied flags were raised over the captured city. However, the victory felt hollow. The primary Axis forces had escaped to fight another day. The last German soldiers crossed the Messina Strait on August 17th, completing an evacuation that military historians would study for decades. Kesselring had lost Sicily, but saved his armies, a strategic trade-off that would complicate Allied plans for the Italian campaign. As the guns fell silent over Sicily, both sides began counting the cost of 38 days of bitter warfare. The Mediterranean's largest island had been conquered, but at a price that foreshadowed even costlier battles ahead on the Italian peninsula. The Mediterranean sun rose on August 18, 1943, over Sicily. Finally at peace, after 38 days of devastating warfare, Colonel Benjamin Vandiver of the 82nd Airborne Division stood on Messina's ancient waterfront, watching the last smoke columns drift away from destroyed German positions across the strait. The Battle of Sicily was over, but its consequences would reshape the entire course of World War II. General Eisenhower arrived in Messina on August 19th to survey the results of his largest military gamble to date. The Supreme Allied Commander understood that Sicily's conquest was merely the beginning. The decision to invade the Italian mainland had already been made, and preparations were underway for even costlier battles ahead. "We've opened the door to Hitler's fortress Europe," Eisenhower told his staff officers as they toured the captured city. "Now, we have to walk through it, and the Germans will make us pay for every step." The general's words proved prophetic. The Italian campaign would last until Germany's surrender in May 1940. The human cost of the Sicilian campaign was sobering. Allied casualties totaled approximately 23,000 killed, wounded, and missing, while Axis losses exceeded 170,000. Primarily Italian prisoners who had lost all will to continue fighting. However, the majority of German forces had escaped to fight another day. Field Marshal Kesselring's evacuation was recognized even by Allied commanders as a masterpiece of military planning and execution. Over 100,000 Axis troops and 10,000 vehicles had crossed the Messina Strait, along with valuable heavy equipment that would soon be used against Allied forces advancing up the Italian peninsula. The political ramifications extended far beyond the Mediterranean theater. Italy's withdrawal from the Axis alliance, though not officially announced until September 8th, was already a foregone conclusion. Hitler's southern flank was crumbling, forcing Germany to deploy additional divisions to defend territories previously held by Italian forces. Sicilian civilians faced the enormous task of rebuilding their shattered island. The campaign had destroyed much of the infrastructure built over centuries of successive civilizations. Ancient towns founded by Greeks and Romans bore fresh scars from modern warfare that would take decades to heal. The lessons learned in Sicily would influence Allied strategy for the remainder of the European war. Amphibious assault techniques perfected on Sicilian beaches were later used at Anzio, Normandy, and southern France. The cooperation between air, naval, and ground forces that characterized Operation Husky became the template for subsequent Allied operations. Captain Robert Murphy, who had landed with the first wave at Gela, reflected on the campaign's significance as he prepared to leave Sicily. "We proved we could take on the Wehrmacht and win," he wrote to his wife in Kansas. "Sicily showed us that Hitler isn't invincible, and his armies can be beaten if we're willing to pay the price." The strategic implications of Sicily's conquest resonated throughout the Axis alliance. Turkey, previously neutral, began moving closer to the Allies. Spain's Franco regime, though still officially non-belligerent, quietly reduced cooperation with Germany. The Mediterranean balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the Allied cause. As documented in post-war military studies, the Battle of Sicily represented a crucial turning point in the Allied learning curve. American forces, relatively inexperienced in European warfare, had proven they could match German tactical proficiency given adequate preparation and support. The Sicilian campaign transformed the United States Army from a promising but untested force into a battle-hardened instrument of Allied victory. The ancient island of Sicily, crossroads of Mediterranean civilization for over 3 millennia, once again witnessed the clash of empires. Greek tyrants, Roman legions, Arab conquerors, Norman knights, and Spanish viceroys had all fought for control of its strategic position. Now American, British, and Canadian forces had added their names to this long historical legacy. By late August 1943, Allied planners were already focused on the next phase, the invasion of the Italian mainland. Sicily had been conquered, but the Battle of Italy was about to begin. The 38 days of fighting on Sicily's ancient soil had opened the door to Hitler's European fortress. But walking through that door would require courage, sacrifice, and determination that would test the Allied alliance to its absolute limits. The Battle of Sicily was over, but its legacy would endure long after the last veteran had passed into history. Victory in Sicily proved that the Axis could be defeated. Democracy could triumph over fascism, and free nations could unite to overcome tyranny. The Mediterranean sun that rose over peaceful Sicilian harbors in August 1943 illuminated not just the end of one campaign, but the beginning of inevitable Allied victory in the greatest conflict in human history.